This Week in Fish and Wildlife, sponsored by your local Montana Toyota dealers.
Thursday morning, time once again for This Week in Fish and Wildlife. Once again, we're at Region 3 headquarters here in Bozeman. Morgan Jacobson joining us this morning. Got some numbers in from the past hunting season. One of the things that we were really looking for, I know that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks was looking for, some numbers on chronic wasting disease, trying to get a handle on where it is. Let's kind of go over what we learned from this past hunting season on that, if you can.
Yeah, we learned a lot, Chet. We over this past year, since last April, we've collected roughly 7,000 samples from deer, elk, and moose here in Montana. A lot of those, a growing number, about 15% this year, were submitted by hunters. Of those 7,000 samples, about 140 tested positive for chronic wasting disease. So our sampling efforts over the past year focused in on the High Line and in southeastern Montana, as well as in Phillipsburg and Libby. And so those were kind of the priority sampling areas. This next year, it'll kind of rotate. We will see some priority sampling areas here in southwest Montana. We did recently detect chronic wasting disease in white-tailed deer near Sheridan, and so it's likely that we'll see some targeted surveillance there. Really, what we want hunters to keep in mind as we kind of wrap up the season is that chronic wasting disease is here in Montana. It is important to be mindful of that, to prevent and slow the spread of that disease. We aren't going to try to manage to remove the disease, to eradicate it, but to keep it at a low prevalence level.
You had mentioned earlier that some of the information you got was about 15% coming from hunters. We had talked about that earlier. That is a big part of how this is going to work, isn't it? Hunters are going to end up having to play a role in this if we're going to truly see where it is.
Oh, hunters have a significant role, absolutely. This past year was the first year that test was free for hunters. They could, as long as they could ship it to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, FWP would pay for that test. And so we did see a lot more samples that were submitted by hunters this year. And if it wasn't for those hunter submissions, we wouldn't know that we had chronic wasting disease in the Sheridan area, for example. Those results were from hunter submitted samples. So we want hunters to continue to participate in that, submit samples of their deer, elk, or moose as they can, and if they have questions, they can contact Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. We also have a video on our website of how to take those samples from their harvested animal.
Oh, that's fantastic. You mentioned elk and moose as well. This is, I think a lot of people think of it as in the deer population, but it's those ungulates. We're talking about that whole classification of animals, aren't we?
Yeah, so most of the samples where we get positive test results are in deer, white-tailed deer and mule deer. But you're right, it extends to the deer family, so that includes moose and elk. This was the first season where we found positive detections in moose and elk. And so, yeah, as hunters harvest those animals, we'd also love to take samples of those as well.
That's perfect. Again, Morgan Jacobson joining us this morning, talking about chronic wasting disease that we know is here in Montana and the important role that hunters will play in trying to figure out what's happening with it. Morgan, thank you very much. And that's This Week in Fish and Wildlife.
This Week in Fish and Wildlife was sponsored by Toyota. Let's go places.